Set the stage for us, Ken. The lower courts have consistently, as we said, ruled that the president overstepped with these tariffs. But based on what we heard, does it sound like this Supreme Court will follow suit or not?
Well, look, Chris, it's always perilous to intuit exactly what justices believe from their comments and questions. But even those of us who aren't constitutional scholars or even lawyers could hear from these arguments the deep skepticism in the words of three of the conservative justices, Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett, and Chief Justice Roberts. You know, Amy Coney Barrett wrote a book in which she said that the rules of statutory interpretation are clear. Number one, read the statute. Number two, read the statute. And number three, read the statute. And she made that point very clearly today. This statute does not include the word tariff. And it was pretty clear that she was deeply skeptical about the idea that Donald Trump could essentially remake the tariff regime, citing these emergency powers. And Neil Gorsuch raised the prospect. He told John Sauer, the Solicitor General, that the implication of your argument is that a future president could declare a climate crisis and impose a 50% tariff on all imported gas-powered cars. And when I heard that, I thought to myself, does anyone think this conservative majority is going for that, for the prospect of that someday with a Democratic president? So I think that's where we stand. It'll be interesting to see where the other three conservatives come down. Alito, Thomas, expressing some sympathy with the arguments of the Trump administration and getting into some nuances. But it's pretty clear that the Trump position on tariffs is in some trouble here.
All right. Thank you for that. I know you're going to go back to listening to the arguments, and we may come back to you at some point. But Chuck, in very complex arguments for somebody who doesn't have a law degree, and I include myself in that, Ken just pointed out something that all of us can understand, at least if you believe what Amy Coney Barrett believes, which is read the statute, read the statute, read the statute. So we all got that. Mm-hmm. What did you hear, though? What else did you hear that you think might be critical as we're analyzing exactly what the justices are thinking about here?
Yeah, well, Chris, I barely have a law degree.
Oh, please.
But drawing on that.
You are our constitutional scholar, so help us out here.
Well, then you are all in deep trouble. There was a degree of skepticism on the court, and it would be an extraordinary, I think, delegation by implication if Congress gave up its power designated to it in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution to raise revenue and lay taxes to a president who could invoke it simply by declaring a national emergency, as this president has done. But one word of caution, Chris, we often think of these cases as whether or not the Supreme Court will give President Trump more power. And I think institutionally it's really a question of whether this court will give the presidency more power. Because if it grants this power to President Trump, it grants it to all presidents. A Democratic president would have the very same authority to declare a national emergency and raise revenue by imposing tariffs. So I think just institutionally it's important to keep in mind that this power resides textually with Congress. And the question for the Supreme Court is, did Congress in some way, by implication, delegate this to a president?
And Corey, there was a lot of back and forth, and that's what we were just listening to toward the end there about these tariffs being the idea of them being revenue raising, or if they're regulatory tariffs, right? I want to play what Justice Kagan had to say about what the statute actually says and what it doesn't.
Crucially, what it doesn't have here is anything that refers to raising revenue. So it has a lot of verbs, it has a lot of actions that can be taken under this statute. It just doesn't have the one you want.
Well, I would say the notion that all these other verbs are sort of not revenue-raising, like block and prohibit, I think that argument is unconvincing for two reasons. One, of course, is that we're not saying it confers a revenue-raising power. We're saying it confers a regulatory power, and that's a crucial distinction.
Okay, some people may say, look, I've listened to Donald Trump. He has said, in fact, he has bragged repeatedly about the fact that he says trillions of dollars are coming into the federal coffers. Does that make it harder for the government to argue that this isn't about money, or is there some legal thing here that we don't get?
Well, I think it definitely makes it harder. And the main thing that makes it hard is that a tariff is a tax. And you heard that from Neil Katyal in the opening remarks. This case is fundamentally about a principle that we all learned in grade school, which is no taxation without representation. The Congress has the power to tax. And if you think about the Boston Tea Party, that was about a tariff. It wasn't a question about whether or not this is a tax. And now the more fundamental question, equally important, is whether or not IEPA, the statute at issue that's passed after Nixon, grants
the
tariff
emergency powers, right?
Yes.
So I know they kept saying IEPA, and if you join in progress, is this an emergency that he has the power to do this?
Right. And there, I would argue, and I say this in a brief with 8 other scholars that we submitted to the Supreme Court, that not only does it not hand over the power to create tariffs unilaterally and at will, it actually restrains it, because this is a period after the Nixon administration where the Congress, in a rare moment, said, we're going to take back our power. So in the National Emergencies Act and in IEPA, the cousin of the National Emergencies Act, they actually restrain presidential power. So the government is really going to have a hard time arguing that a statute that pulled back power actually granted it. And that, combined with the idea that this is Congress's power to tax, after all, that we're talking about, a fundamental power of Congress, not the president, I think things are looking very good for Neil Katyal and his team.
Well, Basil, as you know, that the tariffs have been a centerpiece of Donald Trump's economic agenda.
Right.
And as I pointed out, he likes to talk about how important they have been to what he believes is the strength of the economy. And we can debate that at another day. But how important is this ruling for him, politically speaking?
Well, I think it's incredibly important, and it's owing to something that Chuck was talking about earlier, because I pulled on one thread, which is the role of institutions in our politics, right? And how voters currently view those institutions. So we can go back, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and think about the fact that we may not have liked our president's policies, but we believe that the institutions were there to serve as the check and balance that we needed. But a lot of that has eroded. Those guardrails are largely gone. And so
if I can say this, because having been on the campaign trail, there were a lot of folks who said to me that they were voting for Donald Trump, even though they didn't like some of the things he said, because they believed exactly that there was a system of checks and balances that would keep him from doing what even they who voted for him thought were too extreme.
But a lot of those guardrails are now gone.
That's
and those people, and a lot of people that voted for him, sometimes we thought about maybe the price of eggs, but it really was for status. That is largely gone in their lives right now. So if you have a lot of voters that don't trust the institutions, then I think your point is really important, that it then goes to, who are we electing as president? And will the Supreme Court at this point create, sort of erect those guardrails or fortify those guardrails to say we have to keep the presidency itself in check? It seems to me that the Supreme Court is the only body that can do that right now, and they're being asked to expand those presidential powers. And that's largely what has animated a lot of voters, right? And we saw that yesterday. They're concerned about the limits of presidential power. Doesn't matter who it is, but it is especially the case with this particular president. And my guess is that you're going to have a Congress that is now looking at what happened last night in these elections and really concerned about their vulnerability locally, because voters don't trust this president in D.C.
So we set up a premise at the beginning, Madison, that this is a hearing with staggering implications. Yes, politically, yes, for the power of the presidency. But what about for the economy? What could it mean?
Well, it's so interesting that we're having this conversation the day after the election, when so many Americans voted on the economy, and we saw those results.
Number one in every state, just about.
It's the economy, stupid, right? It always comes up. But when it comes to the economic impact of these tariffs, I cover Wall Street. So if you talk to the CEO of Chipotle, the CEO of Cava right now, they'll tell you that this economy is struggling, and that consumers who are not of the top 10% are really struggling to make ends meet. They're not able to eat out as often. And we're seeing that tariffs are impacting how people are thinking about spending. We have shipping volumes extremely down. Cardboard box shipments are a nerdy stat that I like to look at, really depleted, because people are worried they're going to get hit with a tariff fee.
I talked to somebody yesterday whose business relies a lot on using products that come off of Etsy. And she was saying how undependable some of them have become, for example.
And so much of this case and the potential result here will fuel even more uncertainty for businesses. I spoke with a board member of a top automaker this week who told me they're not even considering changing their practices due to tariffs, because they'd rather just wait out the next 3.5 years than have to constantly change their policies based off of a legal decision that is continuing to be in flux.
So, Chuck, what are you going to be, what would you teach on this right now? If you had to go into the classroom and say, okay, here are some core principles, and I'm coming to the actual professor next. Here's a core principle for you to think about, to read about, and to understand as a student of law, but also using all of us as students of the law, because that's something we've all had to become recently.
Unlike Corey, I'm not a real professor, but I am a fake one because I go into class once a week at Georgetown and teach national security policy. And I think there's an interesting divide here, and you heard it in some of the questioning. If what's at stake, Chris, is a foreign policy prerogative of the president, then the president gets more deference and more authority. And again, any president, not just this one. And if what's at stake is a domestic question, the question about whether or not tariffs are revenue raising and therefore taxes, then the president, any president, is more circumscribed and gets less running room. And one of the things we talk about in our class is that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, Congress has vacated the playing field. Republicans, Democrats, left, right, House, Senate, they've disappeared. And what it seems to me that presidents abhor a vacuum, and so they fill that void and they take more and more power. The question here, I think, for the court to decide is that if this is a foreign policy power, and it doesn't seem to me that it is, but if it is, the president probably gets what he wants. And if this is a domestic power, then the president probably does not get what he wants.